The Watcher in the Woods, the haunting final showdown that will terrify you. Chapter 1: The Arrival. The road to the new house was long and winding, cutting through the dense canopy of trees that seemed to close in around them the further they drove. The Hendersons had left the city behind in search of something different, something quieter. Michael had been the one to find the house, nestled at the edge of a small town where life moved slower, where the air was thick with the scent of pine and earth. It had been an impulsive decision, spurred by the need for change after the layoff that had shaken their lives to the core. The house itself was almost as old as the town, a sprawling, time-worn structure that carried the weight of its years in the creaking timbers and faded paint. To Michael, it was full of character. To Laura, it felt like a place that had seen too much. Emily and Tommy, their children, were caught between excitement and trepidation as they explored the winding hallways and dusty corners. "This will be good for us," Michael said as he unloaded the last of the boxes from the car, his voice filled with forced optimism. "A fresh start, right?" Laura nodded, her smile weak. She wanted to believe him, to trust that this move would be the solution they needed. But from the moment they had pulled into the driveway, a chill had settled in her bones, one that had nothing to do with the cool autumn air. Inside, the house was a maze of rooms, some of which hadn't seen light in years. The floors creaked under their feet, and the windows rattled in their frames, as if protesting the intrusion. The children ran ahead, their laughter echoing through the empty halls, but Laura couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. It started with small things, doors that would be open when she was sure she had closed them, a chill that lingered in certain rooms even when the fire was burning bright. And then there was the forest, a dark, sprawling expanse that bordered the property. Whenever Laura found herself near it, she felt as though a pair of eyes were fixed on her from somewhere deep within the trees. "Just the wind," Michael would say when she mentioned it, his brow furrowing with concern. "This old place is full of drafts and creaks. It'll take some getting used to." Laura wanted to believe him. She told herself that the unease was just a product of the stress from the move, the unfamiliar surroundings, and the old house settling around them. But the feeling persisted, a low hum of anxiety that thrummed beneath the surface of her thoughts. The town, too, had a peculiar atmosphere. The people were friendly enough, but there was a certain reserve in their smiles, a hesitation when the subject of the house came up. It was during one of these conversations that they met Mrs. Jenkins, a frail woman with sharp eyes that seemed to see more than they let on. "That house," she said one day, her voice low as though afraid of being overheard, "has a history, you know." Laura glanced at Michael, who gave a polite nod. "We've heard some things," he said, trying to sound casual. Mrs. Jenkins pursed her lips, her gaze drifting toward the edge of the forest that loomed in the distance. "It's been empty for a long time. People say it's the woods that keep it that way. The last family that lived there, well, they just disappeared one night. Never found a trace of them. Some folks think it's cursed." Michael laughed it off, but Laura felt a shiver run down her spine. "We don't put much stock in local legends," Michael said lightly, trying to ease the tension. Mrs. Jenkins smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Legends or not, there's something about those woods. Best to keep your children close." As they walked back to the house, Laura couldn't help but glance back at the forest. It stood there, silent and unmoving, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching, waiting. The shadows beneath the trees seemed darker than they should have been, and the silence pressed in around her like a held breath. That night, as she lay in bed, listening to the old house groan and shift, Laura felt a growing sense of dread. It was as though the house itself was trying to tell her something important that she couldn't quite grasp. And from the darkness outside, she could almost sense eyes peering through the windows, watching them as they slept. Chapter 2: The Presence. The days grew shorter as autumn deepened, and with each passing hour, the woods seemed to encroach further upon the house, their twisted branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the windows. The air had a bite to it now, sharp and unforgiving, and the wind carried with it a low, mournful whistle that curled around the eaves and seeped into the rooms like a living thing. Emily and Tommy, unfazed by the ominous atmosphere, had taken to playing near the edge of the forest despite their parents' warnings. The allure of the unknown was too strong for children their age, and the woods, with its dark mysteries and hidden secrets, beckoned to them like a siren's song. They would vanish into the underbrush, returning hours later with tales that made Laura's skin crawl. "We heard voices, Mom," Tommy said one evening, his eyes wide with excitement as he recounted their latest adventure. "Whispers, like someone talking real quiet, but we couldn't see anyone. And there were shadows," Emily added, her voice distant, as if she were speaking from a dream. "They moved through the trees, but when we got close, they were gone." Laura's heart clenched at their words. She had always been protective of her children, but this was different. The forest seemed to be calling to them, drawing them in with a force she couldn't understand, and it filled her with a dread that was becoming harder to ignore. She tried to keep them closer to the house, but their curiosity was insatiable, and the woods continued to exert its pull. The strangeness wasn't confined to the forest. Inside the house, Laura began to notice things that shouldn't have been there. While cleaning the attic, she stumbled upon an old, battered doll, its porcelain face cracked and its dress frayed. It was tucked away in a corner, covered in dust, as though it had been forgotten for years. The sight of it sent a shiver through her, though she couldn't say why. Later, while tending to the garden, she unearthed a rusty pocket watch, its glass cracked and hands frozen in place. There was something unsettling about these discoveries, as if they were remnants of another time, another life that had once existed in this house and had left its mark behind. She mentioned it to Michael, but he merely shrugged, dismissing it as part of the house's old charm. Then came the night when Laura first saw the figure. The moon was full, casting a cold, pale light over the landscape, and the shadows of the trees stretched long and dark across the lawn. Laura was in the kitchen washing dishes when she felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. She glanced up, and through the window she saw it, a tall, indistinct figure standing just beyond the tree line, its form blurred by the shadows but unmistakably human. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but she could feel its eyes on her, cold and unblinking. Her breath caught in her throat as she wiped her hands on a towel and hurried to the living room where Michael was reading. "Michael, there's someone outside," she whispered, trying to keep the fear from her voice. He looked up from his book, frowning. "What do you mean?" "By the trees," she insisted. "Someone's watching the house." Michael sighed, setting his book aside. "I'm sure it's nothing, Laura. Maybe a deer or a trick of the light, but I'll go check." They walked to the window together, but when they reached it, the figure was gone. The edge of the forest stood still and silent, the moonlight casting eerie patterns on the ground, but there was no sign of anyone there. "You see?" Michael said, his tone patient but weary. "There's nothing out there. You're just tired, that's all." But Laura couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense that something was wrong. She knew what she had seen, and it wasn't a trick of the light. The figure had been there, watching, waiting. That night, she lay awake for hours, listening to the creaks and groans of the house, half expecting to hear footsteps outside the window. The following days brought more tension between them. Michael's dismissal of her concerns only made Laura feel more isolated, more certain that something was deeply amiss. The children, too, were changing. Tommy remained his usual boisterous self, but Emily grew quieter, more withdrawn. She spent hours sitting by her bedroom window, staring out at the forest with an expression Laura couldn't read. One afternoon, as Laura was folding laundry, Emily came to her with a strange look on her face. "Mom," she said softly, "the Watcher is lonely." Laura froze, the shirt slipping from her fingers. "What did you say?" "The Watcher," Emily repeated, her voice distant. "He's lonely. He wants to come inside." A wave of cold washed over Laura, leaving her breathless. "Who told you that, Emily? What do you mean?" Emily looked at her with wide, innocent eyes. "He talks to me sometimes, from the woods. He says it's lonely out there, and he wants to come inside where it's warm." Laura's hands trembled as she gripped the laundry basket, her mind racing. This wasn't a game, wasn't just a child's imagination. Something was happening to her daughter, something she couldn't understand, and it terrified her. "Emily," she said firmly, kneeling down to look her daughter in the eye. "You mustn't listen to that voice. Do you understand? You have to stay away from the forest." But even as she spoke, she knew it was futile. The pull of the woods was growing stronger, and Emily was slipping further away, drawn to something dark and unseen that lurked within the trees. And as Laura watched her daughter's expression turn distant once more, she felt a surge of helplessness. The sense that whatever was watching them from the woods had already set its sights on her family, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Chapter 3. The Secrets of the House. The rain began the night. Laura decided to delve into the history of their new home. It came down in relentless sheets, drumming against the windows and filling the air with a cold, damp chill that seeped into every corner of the house. Laura sat at the dining table, surrounded by old books and yellowed papers she had unearthed from the attic. The lamp cast a dim, flickering light over the documents, and the shadows it threw across the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. She had been at it for hours, sifting through brittle pages and faded photographs, trying to piece together the story of the family that had once lived here. The more she read, the more the unease that had been gnawing at her since they moved in began to crystallize into a cold, hard fear. The name she came across repeatedly was Hawthorne, a family that had vanished without a trace nearly 50 years ago. They had been a young couple, much like her and Michael, with 2 children, a boy and a girl. The similarities were unsettling, almost as if history were repeating itself. Laura's fingers trembled as she unfolded a letter she had found tucked between the pages of an old Bible. The paper was brittle, the ink smudged, but she could still make out the words, the desperation in the handwriting. "Something is watching us," the letter began. "It comes from the woods at night. We hear it in the walls, in the floorboards, whispering to the children. They say it wants to come inside." Laura's breath caught in her throat as she read on, the sense of dread growing with each word. The letters grew increasingly frantic, describing how the family had tried to leave, but each time they were drawn back, as if by some invisible force. The final letter ended abruptly, a plea for help that had never been answered. The paper slipped from her hands, drifting to the floor like a dead leaf. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Michael standing in the doorway, his face drawn and tired. He had been working late in the basement, trying to fix a leak they had discovered the week before. But there was something in his expression that made Laura's heart skip a beat, a look of quiet determination tinged with fear. "I found something," he said, his voice low and tense. "You need to see this." Laura followed him down the narrow stairs to the basement, the air growing colder with each step. The walls were lined with rough stone, damp and slick to the touch, and the only light came from the bare bulb that hung from the ceiling, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare over the room. Michael led her to the far corner, where he had pulled back a section of the wall to reveal a hidden passage. "I was fixing the leak when I noticed the wall wasn't solid," he explained, his voice echoing in the confined space. "There's a room back here, Laura. It's been sealed off for years." They stepped through the narrow opening, the smell of mildew and dust thick in the air. The room was small, more of a crawl space than a room, with a low ceiling and walls that seemed to close in on them. Laura's gaze fell on the photographs scattered across the floor, their edges curled and yellowed with age. They were of the Hawthorne family, smiling, happy, unaware of the fate that awaited them. But it was the symbols carved into the walls that made Laura's blood run cold. Strange, intricate designs that seemed to pulse with a dark energy, their meaning unclear, but their intent unmistakable. In the center of the room was a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. Michael handed it to her, and she opened it with trembling hands. The pages were filled with tight, cramped writing, detailing the Hawthorne family's descent into madness as they were tormented by the presence in the woods. The entries grew more erratic, more desperate, as the presence's influence tightened its grip on them. "It won't let us leave," one entry read. "It whispers to the children, promising them things, drawing them closer to the trees. We are trapped, and the more we try to escape, the stronger it becomes. The Watcher is always there, just beyond the tree line, waiting." Laura closed the journal, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of what they had discovered pressed down on her, suffocating in its intensity. "We have to leave, Michael," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We have to get the children and leave this place." But even as she said the words, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. The presence was already inside the house, inside their minds. Emily had grown more distant with each passing day, her gaze fixed on the forest with an intensity that frightened Laura. She spoke less, and when she did, it was in a voice that didn't belong to her, a cold, detached tone that sent shivers down Laura's spine. Tommy, too, had changed. He was no longer the carefree child he had been. He woke screaming in the night, his small body trembling with fear as he clung to Laura, babbling about shadows that came to him in his dreams, trying to take him away to the woods. "We can't stay here," Laura insisted, her voice rising in panic. "We have to leave now." But Michael's expression was grim, his eyes shadowed with doubt. "And go where?" he asked quietly. "If what's in that journal is true, it won't let us go. We're already in its grip." Laura wanted to argue, to scream that they had to try, but deep down, she knew he was right. The house, the forest, it was all connected, part of something far older and darker than she could comprehend. And as she looked at her husband, she realized with a sinking heart that they were already too late. They were no longer in control. The Watcher had them now, and it was only a matter of time before it made its move. Chapter 4. The Descent. The days in the Henderson household stretched out, each one heavier than the last, weighed down by an oppressive sense of dread that seemed to seep into every corner of their lives. The once cozy and inviting house had turned cold, its very walls seeming to pulse with a malevolent energy. The forest, always looming at the edge of their property, had grown darker, the trees no longer just overgrown, but twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Michael, who had dismissed Laura's concerns at first, now found himself gripped by a creeping terror that he could no longer deny. The unease that had once been Laura's burden alone now infected him too. At night, when the house was plunged into darkness, he would lie awake in bed, straining to hear the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls, the soft creak of floorboards under the weight of something unseen. His mind, once a sanctuary of rational thought, was now a battleground between fear and disbelief. It wasn't just the nights that were filled with dread. During the day, shadows moved where they shouldn't, flitting across walls and ceilings, darting out of sight the moment he tried to focus on them. The temperature in the house would drop without warning, a chill so deep it seemed to freeze his bones, and always, just beyond the window, he could feel it. The Watcher. It was no longer content to stay hidden within the forest. It was closer now, watching them, waiting. Emily, once a vibrant and cheerful child, had become a ghost of her former self. She spent hours sitting by the window, staring out at the forest with unblinking eyes, her face pale and expressionless. When Laura or Michael tried to pull her away, she would resist, her small body stiff with a strength that didn't belong to a 12-year-old. "It's almost here," she would whisper, her voice flat and hollow. "The Watcher is almost here." Tommy, too, had changed. His nightmares, once an occasional occurrence, were now a nightly terror. He would wake screaming, his little body soaked in sweat, clutching at his blankets as if they were the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. He spoke less and less, his once bright and curious nature dulled by fear. He refused to go near the windows, and when he looked at the forest, his eyes would fill with a terror that broke Laura's heart. The isolation was suffocating. The townspeople, who had once greeted them with cautious smiles, now avoided them entirely. When Laura ventured into town, people would cross the street to avoid her, their gazes sliding away as if they couldn't bear to meet her eyes. Even Mrs. Jenkins, the kindly old woman who had first warned them about the forest, was now tight-lipped and distant. She would barely open the door when Laura came by, muttering excuses before shutting it again, leaving Laura standing on the porch, her questions unanswered. As the strange occurrences escalated, the house itself seemed to turn against them. Doors that had once creaked open on their own now slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. Objects, books, toys, kitchen utensils, moved when no one was looking, shifting from one place to another as if guided by an unseen hand. The air inside the house was thick with a malevolent presence, a weight that pressed down on them until it was hard to breathe. In a desperate attempt to find answers, Laura reached out to a local historian she had heard about from one of the few townspeople who still spoke to her. The man, Mr. Caldwell, was old with a stooped back and a voice that cracked like dry leaves, but his eyes were sharp and bright with a knowledge that both intrigued and terrified her. When she explained the situation, he listened in silence, his expression growing more grave with each word. Finally, when she had finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long, weary sigh. "The Watcher," he said, his voice a low rumble, "is not a person, but something far worse. A spirit, bound to that forest and that house for centuries. It feeds on fear, draws power from it. Families like yours, it's drawn to them, to their vulnerability, their uncertainty. It won't stop until it has claimed you." Laura's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a stone. "Is there any way to stop it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Caldwell shook his head slowly. "There's no stopping it. Not once it has set its sights on you. Your only hope is to leave, but even that might not be enough. The Watcher, it's clever. It knows how to keep you there, how to make you believe you have no choice but to stay." Laura felt a cold wave of despair wash over her. "But we have to try," she insisted, her voice trembling. "We can't just give up." The old man looked at her with pity, his eyes filled with a sorrow that told her he had seen this before, that he knew how it would end. "You should have never moved into that house," he said softly. "Now it's too late." Laura left the historian's home with a heavy heart, her mind spinning with thoughts of what lay ahead. As she drove back to the house, the trees lining the road seemed to close in on her, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. When she pulled into the driveway, she saw Emily standing by the window, her small face pressed against the glass, her eyes locked on the forest. And for the first time, Laura wondered if there was any way to escape what was coming. Chapter 5: The Confrontation. The night had a weight to it, a stifling, suffocating presence that pressed against the Hendersons as they gathered in the living room. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to twist and writhe on the walls. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, its voice filled with a strange, mournful longing that sent chills down Laura's spine. She could feel the Watcher's presence more acutely now, as if it had seeped into the very air they breathed. Emily sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the forest beyond. Her face was pale, her expression vacant, but there was a tension in her small frame, as though she were straining to hear a call that only she could perceive. Tommy clung to Michael, his little hands clutching his father's shirt, his eyes wide with fear. Laura stood near the fireplace, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to gather the courage to speak. "We can't go on like this," Laura finally said, her voice trembling but resolute. "It's only getting stronger. We have to face it, whatever it is, before it takes Emily, and Tommy too." Michael's face was drawn, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He nodded, his jaw clenched tight. "We have to go into the woods," he agreed, though his voice was laced with dread. "It won't stop until we do." Laura glanced at Emily, who seemed oblivious to the conversation, her gaze still locked on the darkened trees outside. "Emily," Laura said softly, moving to kneel beside her daughter. "We're going to the forest, sweetheart. We're going to face the Watcher." For a moment, Emily didn't respond, her eyes glassy and distant. Then, slowly, she turned to Laura, a faint smile curling at the corners of her lips. "It's waiting for us," she whispered, her voice strangely calm. "It's time." A shiver ran down Laura's spine at the tone of her daughter's voice, but she pushed the fear aside. They had no other choice. They couldn't leave. Something in the depths of the forest wouldn't allow it. The house, the land, it held them fast in its grip, drawing them deeper into the web of fear and mystery. The family gathered their coats and flashlights, the small beams of light offering little comfort against the suffocating darkness that awaited them. Together, they stepped out into the night, the cold air biting at their skin as they made their way toward the edge of the woods. The trees loomed tall and menacing before them, their branches intertwined like gnarled fingers, casting strange, twisted shadows on the ground. Emily walked ahead, her steps steady, her small frame illuminated by the flickering light of her flashlight. She moved as if she knew the way, as if something in the forest was guiding her. Laura and Michael followed, with Tommy between them, his hand clutching Laura's tightly. The deeper they ventured, the quieter the world around them became. The usual nocturnal sounds, rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, were absent, replaced by a heavy silence that was almost tangible. Every step felt like an intrusion, as if the very earth beneath their feet resented their presence. The sense of being watched grew stronger with each passing moment, an unseen gaze that bore into them from every angle, sending prickles of fear crawling up their spines. As they walked, they began to notice remnants of the past scattered among the trees. An old, rotting swing hung from a branch, its rope frayed and barely holding together. A rusted tricycle lay on its side, half buried in the underbrush, its paint chipped and faded. The decaying remains of a cabin came into view, its roof caved in, the windows dark and empty like hollow eyes staring out at them. "Look," Michael whispered, pointing to a cluster of objects near the base of a large oak tree. Laura knelt beside the pile, her heart sinking as she picked up a tattered photograph. The edges yellowed with age. The image was of a family, 2 parents and a child, standing in front of the same house the Hendersons now called home. The faces were blurred, the features indistinct, but there was something familiar about the scene that made Laura's blood run cold. "These were theirs," Laura murmured, her voice trembling as she placed the photograph back on the ground. The family that disappeared. As if in response to her words, the wind picked up, swirling around them in a frenzy, pulling at their clothes and hair. The trees creaked and groaned, their branches swaying ominously, as if alive. The air grew colder, biting into their skin, and the darkness deepened, swallowing the weak light of their flashlights. At last, they reached a small clearing at the heart of the forest. The ground was bare, the earth blackened and scorched as if a fire had once raged here, leaving nothing but ash in its wake. In the center of the clearing stood the Watcher. The figure was tall, almost inhumanly so, its form shrouded in shadows that seemed to shift and writhe like smoke. Its face was a mask of sorrow and rage, the features twisted in a grotesque expression of torment. The Watcher's eyes glowed with an eerie light, fixating on Emily with an intensity that made Laura's heart lurch in her chest. "Emily," the Watcher whispered, its voice a rasping echo that seemed to come from all directions at once. "You are the key." Emily took a step forward, her eyes locked on the figure, her expression serene. "I know," she replied, her voice soft but unwavering. "No," Laura cried, stepping in front of her daughter, her arms outstretched protectively. "Take me instead. Leave her alone." The Watcher's gaze shifted to Laura, and for a moment, the air grew still, the wind dying down to a breathless silence. Then, slowly, the figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and bony, tipped with sharp, claw-like nails. It hovered over Laura's head, as if considering her offer, the air thick with tension. "You cannot break the curse," the Watcher intoned, its voice heavy with ancient sorrow. "But you may take her place." Laura's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the figure's words. But before she could respond, Emily pushed past her, stepping into the clearing, her small figure dwarfed by the Watcher's looming presence. "You've waited long enough," Emily said, her voice carrying a strange authority that didn't belong to a child. "It's time to end this." The Watcher's expression softened, the rage fading from its features, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. It lowered its hand, the fingers brushing against Emily's cheek in a gesture that was almost tender. The glow in its eyes dimmed, and the shadows that clung to its form began to dissipate, unraveling into the night air. Laura and Michael watched in stunned silence as the figure began to fade, its form growing more translucent with each passing second. Emily stood still, her eyes closed, her expression peaceful, as if she were saying goodbye to an old friend. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the Watcher was gone. The clearing was empty, the air still and calm once more. The forest seemed to sigh in relief, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, the oppressive darkness lifting like a veil. Laura rushed to Emily, pulling her into a tight embrace, tears streaming down her face. Michael joined them, wrapping his arms around both of them, his relief palpable. "It's over," Laura whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. It's finally over. But as they made their way back to the house, a lingering unease settled in Laura's chest. The Watcher was gone, but the forest remained, silent and watchful. And though the presence that had tormented them had vanished, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that they were not yet free from its grasp. The curse, it seemed, was not so easily broken. Chapter 6: The Resolution. The night was thick with the weight of the past, the air heavy with the remnants of sorrow and loss. Laura stood alone in the clearing, her breath visible in the cold, still air. The Watcher, or what remained of it, hovered before her, a wraith-like figure, its form now dim and indistinct. It no longer held the terrifying presence it once did. Instead, it seemed frail, almost human in its vulnerability. Laura's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm, focusing on the truth she had finally grasped. This was no malevolent force born from malice or evil. It was a soul shackled by its own torment, bound to the land by chains of guilt and despair. The realization was like a key turning in a lock, opening a door to understanding she hadn't known existed. "You were like us once, weren't you?" Laura's voice was soft, carrying in the stillness of the night. The Watcher's gaze fixed on her, the sorrow in its eyes deepening. It did not speak, but its silence was answer enough. "You were trapped here, unable to move on, haunted by your own fears. But it doesn't have to be this way. You can let go." The wind stirred, rustling the leaves around them, but the Watcher remained motionless, as if caught in a moment of hesitation. Laura took a step closer, her fear giving way to a deep, aching compassion. "I forgive you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Whatever happened, whatever you did, you don't have to carry it anymore. You can be free." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence between them, the night holding its breath. Then, slowly, the Watcher began to change. The shadows that clung to its form started to dissolve, unraveling like threads in the wind. The sorrow in its eyes lifted, replaced by something that might have been peace. It reached out, a spectral hand brushing against Laura's cheek, and for the briefest instant she felt warmth, an echo of the life it had once known. And then, the Watcher was gone. The clearing was empty, the air lighter, as if the very atmosphere had been cleansed of the darkness that had lingered for so long. Laura stood there, alone in the night, the weight of what had just happened settling over her like a blanket. She felt both exhausted and relieved, a strange mix of emotions swirling in her chest. The forest, once oppressive and menacing, now seemed to breathe with a quiet serenity. The trees stood tall and still, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The house in the distance no longer loomed with malevolent intent. It was just a house, stripped of the evil that had taken root within its walls. When Laura returned to her family, they could see the change in her. The lines of worry that had etched her face were softened, her eyes clear and calm. Michael took her hand, his grip firm and steady, and together they looked at their children, Emily and Tommy, who were slowly returning to themselves, the shadows of the past fading from their young faces. Days passed, and the forest remained tranquil, the house now silent and still. The Hendersons moved through their days with a new sense of purpose, but also with the quiet understanding that their lives had been irrevocably altered. The events they had endured left marks, invisible but deep, etched into their hearts and minds. "We should leave," Michael said one morning, his voice quiet but firm. Laura nodded in agreement, knowing that the time had come. This place had been a chapter in their lives, a place of fear and revelation, but it was not their home. Some places, they now understood, were better left behind, undisturbed by those who would seek to make them their own. As they packed their belongings, there was a sense of finality in the air, a closing of a door on a part of their lives that they would never fully leave behind. But there was also a sense of hope, of moving forward with the knowledge that they had faced their fears and emerged stronger. On the day they left, the sun shone brightly, casting long shadows as they drove away. The road wound through the forest, the trees lining the path like silent sentinels. Laura glanced in the rearview mirror, her gaze drawn to the woods that had held them captive for so long. Emily, sitting in the back seat, did the same, her eyes lingering on the place where they had faced the Watcher and won. And then, just as they were about to round a bend, Emily saw it, a figure, faint and distant, standing at the edge of the woods. It was little more than a silhouette, a wisp of shadow against the trees, but there was something in its stance, in the way it watched them, that sent a shiver down her spine. "Mom," Emily whispered, her voice trembling, but when Laura turned to look, the figure was gone, as if it had never been there at all. The car continued down the road, the forest receding into the distance. But the memory of that last glimpse stayed with Emily, a lingering question in the back of her mind. Had the Watcher truly been freed? Or was it something else? Something that would always be there, just out of sight, watching, waiting. The Hendersons left the house behind, but as they drove toward their new life, a sense of unease clung to them, a reminder that some mysteries were never fully solved, and some fears were never entirely banished. The road stretched out before them, long and winding, leading them away from the past and toward whatever lay ahead. But even as they moved forward, the memory of the Watcher lingered, a shadow on the edge of their thoughts, never fully fading, never entirely gone. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing short story. See you in the next one.